Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Red Lettuce. I'm your host, Eric, and I'm joined by my co-host, Fox. And we have with us tonight, Erich Arbor. Eric, why don't you introduce yourself? But first, before you do that, please let us know if you're white or not. Because that's
It depends on who you're asking, I guess. If my profile on the social medias is of a white man, so, but I don't know. I guess they'll never know if I'm not going to give them that much. But that was stupid. But I just I write about like socialist movements and the history relating to that at erich-arbor.medium.com. I recently have written about decolonization and how we discuss that in the United States, and how there's like a lot of issues of like creating this like straw man of indigeneity, how we don't really see indigenous people as like having material wants, but like conceptual desires such as like land back or decolonize, and we don't really define that. And in addition to that, I also wrote something about, I guess it was more involving around petty bourgeois theory. I hate saying that because it's like it makes me sound like a nerd, but it essentially centers around how we can't fall prey to certain ideologies that are sort of manufactured in like an academic setting or like a place of like upper class, such as like Trotskyism. And then I also discuss whatever we could call is formulated in Sakai's book Settlers, and how that represents a sort of anti-worker tendency within the left.
I think we should talk about your Sakai piece first, because we're going to talk about that, and also your decolonization article as well. Because I've read some of the Sakai text, and I could already see that it's an attack on Marxism and class analysis. We know, but I mean, like we know it's true that there has been racist elements that have existed throughout the labor movement and trade unions in our history. But I noticed like immediately that there were numerous uncited stats, misquotations, and cherry-picked sources in Sakai's book. And you read this not once, but twice. And you point out numerous issues in this book. So talk about your critique. And given that Sakai identifies as a Maoist, what do you think his motive would be in writing this book?
Well, I think that it's interesting the way we talk about Sakai, because whenever you discuss it, you're never really discussing it in the way that the person who like you're talking to wants it to be heard. In terms of like people who want to speak for it and defend it. I think it popped up maybe like a year ago online as like the thing that everyone needs to read, along with like State and Revolution, the Manifesto, on Authority by Engels, or like any of like the prolific texts. It's like all these classics, but also this. And I think it comes from possibly like a holdover of like white fragility of like any rad lib that wants to sort of extend that into their more like their newfound communist politics. They feel guilty abandoning some sort of non-materialist study. So maybe this kind of is the puzzle piece that fits in that respect. Just because from where I see it, so Sakai presents himself as like an academic, we don't, I mean, obviously he's kind of like an anonymous figure, and like obviously like I don't have any issue with that. I think that that's okay. It I think the issue is how, I guess, certain things can be co-opted into like the language of what he says, and how perhaps liberals may find no issue with what he has to say, when in fact like liberals do not actually question systems and like I guess sort of, yeah, like systems of oppression, which are typically critically analyzed by Marxists in a sort of dialectical way. So I think what I found most issue with the book is, and what I point to in the article mainly, I'm not, and I never would say like, don't read this, it's bullshit, it's blah, blah, blah. Like, you should read it, you should investigate. And like, I'm glad that Erich Unger did that as well, and through that is finding similar issues with it. I just found a major difficulty in understanding the sort of claim that the sort of labor aristocracy doesn't have a certain form of revolutionary potential, and to hear that from someone who like asserts themselves as an academic comes off as like problematic to me. And I point about how like Trotsky, he never spoke Yiddish. He felt it was beneath him, but and he was Jewish. He was raised in like a sort of, one could probably make the case that he was like a kulak, or grew up in like an estate in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then when he was trying to organize the Russian Jewry, he had a lot of issue with that, because I mean, Yiddish was like almost enforced on like the Jewish peasantry, because the Tsar had banned them from learning or being literate in Russian. So a lot of what Trotsky kind of promulgates of this idea of like permanent revolution, it goes against what normal people in Russia or in eventually the Soviet Union had actually wanted, because he had a sort of class character that counters what like workers actually want. And so this is kind of what I see being repeated here. The other thing that I find an issue with is sort of how it atomizes and like assigns this individualist blame for colonialism. And I think this is something that we on the left understand really well with climate change. Like, we know, like at this point, we know bringing like a reusable plastic bag to the grocery store, or like not flushing the toilet every time you go, or like recycling vigilantly will not save the planet by itself. There's like 100 companies in the world that we can name and that we know, including the U.S. military, that are causing the majority of climate change. And so the way that we understand like that result necessitates like a collectivist solution to that, and not this sort of individualist solution, is definitely a more, it's carried out through like a more like Marxist point of view. So that's where I would like the left to sort of reanalyze the left, I guess like the more like rad lib left. Obviously, I think that maybe we come to a different understanding. How colonialism is a system, and if you don't say this clearly, you're sort of mystifying and like obfuscating it, like, and you're almost helping it kind of perpetuate itself by saying, where, oh well, this worker, like they got laid off during NAFTA, they had a really good union job, you know what, like they shouldn't complain because like their iPhone was made from like like blood minerals in like South Africa. And like while that's like yeah, we can address colonialism obviously, but by sort of dividing workers up in the imperial core, you're almost making revolution impossible. Hence making colonialism and imperialism also like the abolition of the two also impossible.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it does seem that what people would normally call the left, which are just liberals, which are just left-wing imperialists, that these so-called leftists are like siphoning left-wing activists into the graveyard that is the Democratic Party, and they don't see that as like any type of problem, and they see that organizing outside of the system is itself a problem. So they're really just anti-leftists disguising themselves as leftists. And I mean, they're the social grifters, they're the fascists, they're the white supremacists, because then they advocate for like Joe Biden. Like, sure, they're plugging their nose, but they're still pointing a gun at me, and they're like, oh, you gotta, suck it up, and or you're endorsing Trump or some shit like that. And it's just crazy to me, the lengths that they go to try to justify these things, while also ignoring that they're imperialists. Like, they don't understand what they're perpetuating and the ideology that they're rallying behind. It's really frustrating, and it's really hard to organize when people won't let it go.
Yeah, totally. I think that there's like these divisions that like could be sort of overcome, and I think that there's sort of like purity tests that maybe not are like prescient in like the current time frame, but I think that what I feel is a lot of this stuff comes easy to like this sort of radical liberal, because it never really sort of had them questioning, like it never really presented a direct challenge to their prior like thought process, because I mean I grew up like in a pretty like very vote blue no matter who household, and so there were a lot of things that I felt I had to unlearn, whereas my partner did not, because his parents were Democrats, but they had sort of left the party during the era of Trump, and they were more conservative in ways that he was raised in a way where, when he came to Marxism, it just made logical sense, whereas I feel like liberals have to sort of make up these sort of lies, or like, I don't know, try and go these like circuitous lengths to like connect dots that don't really make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're already used to this sort of idea of like being unprincipled, I guess, for lack of a better term. So like when presented with something so like unhelpful, unproductive, or just like irrelevant to like the needs of like the typical worker in the United States, they don't find it troubling.
Yeah, I mean, what I find troubling is, I think this kind of speaks to, like, I think there's a cult of personality here that's really strong in the U.S. And especially when it comes to this book. I'm not afraid to really say it, because I've really encountered some people who are really entrenched and blindly believing everything that is said in this book is like gospel. And I've seen like a few YouTube like personalities or people that, claim to be Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, like really promote this book, and they never question that. There's like no questioning of it. And when you do question it, you get labeled a chauvinist. Like me, I got labeled a chauvinist and a borderline racist. Um, and when, you know, you, as you point out in your article, you point out that Sakai totally slanders William Z. Foster, who's like a really big union leader here and a socialist, very anti-racist person, but Sakai paints him as this like virulent racist. And he totally not just misquotes him, but he manipulates everything that he says to make him out to be one. And I think that really says a lot about people who read these books uncritically. And I don't know, I'm wondering what kind of criticisms you received, anything close to this, or like, you know, or maybe you want to speak to that whole misquoting of William Z. Foster, and maybe explain like who really William Z. Foster was as well.
Sure. So yeah, I'll start with that. I mean, so William Z. Foster was the founder of the Communist Party USA, I believe in 1919, after he had witnessed, the world had witnessed the October Revolution, and Lenin sort of had this like belief that, well, and I assume it was shared with many, that the United States needed a communist party. And there was a great steel strike, I believe in 1919. It's called, I guess, the Great Steel Strike, of which William Z. Foster was very involved within. And he was able, it ended up being a bit of like a win-lose situation where they were able to meet some of the demands. I think some of these people were literally working like 24-hour shifts, and they were able to bump that down to like 12 hours, which is, I mean, it's just like, you know, it's 1919, and and so they were very vigilant. It became a very militant movement. However, there was a large issue with them recruiting scabs, or the bosses hiring scabs to fill the wager or the labor of the strikers. And a large amount of these people who were scabs were actually sharecroppers in the South, unfortunately. And why that was such an issue was because the bosses, as the capitalist class has done for centuries, employed racism as a way to sort of divide the workers, because they knew that it wasn't just cheaper to hire Black people at this time, as it is probably still, but they knew that it would sow division between the white workers and the Black, because I mean, if you're striking for a job that you're trying so hard to gain some better like dignity and whatever, and you see a certain race always fill your job, and kind of go against any form of solidarity, one, without kind of thinking deeper into that, would obviously assume, well, why are they all like against me? Like, why are they always siding with my boss? Like, don't they know any better? And so that kind of culminated into like a major tension, obviously, within the Black and white working class in the United States. Adding to like an ongoing tension that was perpetuated by these the planter class, the steel owning class, the oil barons, what have you. And so Foster was the first to really point this out as an issue, because there was issues of segregation within the unions, obviously, and obviously, like, that's one of the things that Sakai does point out, but he sees it as more of a feature than a bug, if you would. So here's something, I'll just even go quote Foster. He says, "They know little of the race problem in the industry who declare that it can be settled merely by the unions opening their doors to the Negroes. It is much more complex than that and will require the best thought that conscientious whites and blacks can give it. The Negro has the more difficult part to solve in resisting the insidious efforts of unscrupulous white employers and misguided intellectuals of his own race to make a professional strikebreaker of him. But I am confident that he will win out and will take his place where he belongs in the industrial fight, side by side with the white worker." He also goes on, "So serious was this race situation in the steel strike that the National Committee for Organizing Iron and Steel Workers requested President Gompers, who is president of the union, or the committee, to arrange a conference between prominent Negro leaders and trade union officials. To that end, the proper remedies may be indicated." He keeps talking. Or the need for action looking towards a better relations between whites and blacks in the industrial field should be instantly patent, for there can no doubt be that the employing class, taking advantage of the bitter animosities of the two groups, are deliberately attempting to turn the Negroes into a race of strikebreakers with whom to hold the white workers in check. Should they succeed to any degree, it would make out industrial disputes take on more and more the character of Nazi masturbation fantasies, a consummation that would be highly injurious to the white workers and eventually ruinous to the blacks. So obviously, you may, if you disagree, let me know, but I would say that this is someone who obviously understands race in the United States with regards to labor practices pretty thoroughly. In addition to that, and under his guidance, the CPUSA would go on to have it would be the first integrated political party in the United States, and it would also be the first to really discuss lynching as a political issue, where they had a political line directly in it where they wanted the death penalty for lynchers, and that's something that they sort of tried to lobby during the Roosevelt administration. He also had a black vice president running mate, I think in 1932, and this was the era of in which, like, Paul Robeson also was leading the charge and talking about socialism and communism as a CPUSA member, and this was a party that was very formative, a very significant part in forming what we know as the 20th century civil rights movement. So I think when Sakai goes on to sort of misquote him, it comes off as almost just like a clear, it's clearly in bad faith. So I'll just end with this Sakai quote. So Foster's lynch mob oratory was only restrained by the formality expected of a Euro-American communist leader. His white supremacist message was identical to, but more politely clothed than the crude rants of the Ku Klux Klan. He warned that the capitalists were grooming Africans as, quote, a race of strikebreakers with whom to hold the white workers in check, on much the same principle as the Tsars used the Cossacks to keep in the subjugation of the Russian people. It is easy to see how Foster became such a popular leader among the settler workers.
I mean, that's just like, to me, after reading those two things side by side and seeing how manipulated that was, that to me would like discredit the entire book just based off that, because that would mean that if Sakai would go to these lengths to manipulate someone's words to make it seem like he's a racist when he's not, should really discredit his whole body of work, to me.
I agree.
Like just that alone, especially like someone like William Z. Foster. I mean, that to me just like is like a total red flag. And when you present this evidence, when you present this, did anyone question it, or did you get attacked for it? Or what was the response to this for you?
You know, I would say I don't really get that much blowback on it directly. I know certain people who have shared it have gotten some issue with it, but it doesn't really doesn't really wash up on my shores, I guess you could say.
Well, I'm glad to take bullets for it, because this is just such like a blatant, clear as day falsehood.
Yeah, it's a slap in the face to people who are trying to do a lot of this work of dismantling white supremacy and combating it head on. There are people who talk about, oh, decolonize your mind, and they say things like, you've got to dismantle racism, and they at the same time, in the same breath, will shit on anybody who questions the racism of what like liberals call the left. Like they think themselves as the left, and so that's what I mean in this context as the left.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say, they'll posture themselves as like the opposition to racism, and in the same breath they'll tell anybody who questions their support for Joe Biden or the Democratic Party, just for a recent example, as racist. Like they're saying, you don't care about Black people, but less white people are voting for Trump right now, and more people of color and more marginalized groups are voting for Trump. And I think I wonder like how liberals can continue to hold this position that they aren't problematic in any way. And it's got to be exhausting just trying to shit on actual leftists outside of the Democratic Republican binary.
No, it's like you're kind of trying to tell people to like unlearn all of this stuff, yet like they have yet to like unlearn certain liberal kind of knee-jerk reactions to things.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, like that's where I think this idea that like the labor aristocracy is far more like revolutionary, or like willing for change at the least.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have, I mean, most like in the previous election, a lot of union members disobeyed their leadership and voted for Trump, even though the union had endorsed Hillary Clinton. Now, even this year, and now this year, we're at a point where 1 in 5 Black men voted for Trump. So it like this sort of, oh, and they'll find ways to sort of justify it. They're self-hating, or they have a colonized mindset, or whatever. But it doesn't. They don't provide an answer to why are people unhappy? Why will people vote for Donald Trump over any Democrat at this point?
and that type of infantilization itself is pretty racist, in my opinion. I think if
Yes,
you
of
aren't,
course.
yeah, if you don't understand why Black people don't want to vote for Joe Biden, you're missing the point. And I receive a lot. I post a lot of my thoughts about this on Facebook, and I get a lot of pushback from it, from people I don't know, but also people that I'm really close with, and it's really hard trying to talk to them about this, because I think that they don't want to hear, like they're either not ready to confront it, they don't like hearing it, but also they don't want to hear about racism from a white twink on the internet. Like I'm sorry, but the Democrats are being super racist to China right now. Like, they are not the line of defense against Trump for racism against Asians right now. Like, they are perpetuating racism against China at this moment. They do it by supporting, separatist movements, and they are xenophobic. Like, that's just what they are. But I can't figure it out. I can't figure out why they think like this, and why they behave this way, and why it's so hard to engage with people who have talked for the past 10 years about fighting racism, and when you call it out, like, people, it's like they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of like Hannah Jones on Twitter being like, I think like I don't know if it was today or last night, she said something about how like Latinos and Asians, like, voting against Joe Biden is like, shows that like they are just like achieving whiteness or whatever. And it's like, but well, and not only is that like ignoring like the aforementioned like defection of Black voters to Trump, it's like, why, like, then maybe it's not a racial question. Maybe the race is not the singular, like, salient sort of unifier of these voters.
Right. But so why do liberals hold on to race science to inform their politics? Do you think that's a form of white supremacy? Because I really think so. Do you think this is making like a friendlier colonial settler that reinforces the empire? Because I also think that that's what's happening here.
Well, I mean, like, when you think about it, I mean, there's other books obviously that like have been written about like race in the United States. There's Black Reconstruction by W.B. Du Bois, who sort of talks about how like public schools, and like he talks about like the material benefits of Reconstruction, and how it sort of formulated like a differing society in the South during Reconstruction, and like public health clinics, public schools. A lot of these things didn't exist in like the American South prior to this, and it's not like they were just offered to like Black people. They were offered to like poor white sharecroppers as well. And like he says, like, this is a good thing, and this is something that was like one of the greatest issues with like it wasn't the fact that like simply that the white, like, I guess we focus on how the end of Reconstruction was the end of sort of this sort of anachronistic inequality in the past, and like the KKK just rolled in and erased all the progress. But I think that was also just like another tragedy in itself, that working people didn't receive the amount of like sort of like public public amenities or access to healthcare and education and whatnot, and I believe even housing in some respects, just through the literal reconstruction of the South. But we see it more as a racial issue, and perhaps that could also be illuminated by Theodore Allen, who writes like The Invention of the White Race, which is sort of how the ruling class sort of divided workers in terms of indentured servitude and slavery, and how that was largely a racialized question, even though the things carried out were, while the terms of how long you became a slave or an indentured servitude varied. I would even say that the terms of being a slave varied throughout the history of this country. Some were like in terms of indentured servitude, some were obviously lifetime. But it was an active effort to divide the working class by race. So you see that then, you see that during the era of Reconstruction, you see that in the civil rights era, where they start to say that communism is racial, like race mixing or whatever. You see those old images of like segregationists kind of like rallying in front of like courthouses or whatever, and like schools. And so now in this sort of new like anti-racist era, you like wonder why Amazon and Burger King and like all these corporations are now suddenly taking this anti-racist stance.
Mm-hmm.
And you just can't help but wonder also why in the era of like the demonization of the lower middle class or lower class poor worker in the Midwest, how they're automatically labeled like a Trump supporter and a reactionary, where like this anti-racism, like born out of like coastal elite academia, doesn't benefit capital and like the ruling class in like a similar way that where racism would.
Yeah, and I think that kind of just touches on, you know, the primary contradiction, which is class society, and that's how racism is really intertwined with class society. It's not separate. It's all intertwined. All the other, you know, all the oppressions that we see are intertwined with the, you know, class society and how it's all set up. And you know, some people like to think that race is the primary contradiction, and it can be resolved under this system, under a class society, and that's not a material analysis. That's just not correct. So, and I think that's where a lot of the race essentialist, ultra woke tendencies kind of emerge from. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, and I would actually like. There's a fun test that fellow online person at EcoTwink on Twitter. They have also had EcoTwink actually discussed this sort of phenomenon of where there's these people who are sort of like berating people by calling them class reductionists online. If you do like a Twitter search with their app or like handle, along with like Elizabeth Warren or Warren, they all have like some sort of like favorable like or like like post or like sort of saying that like how they're really excited for her campaign like a year ago. So it is like this sort of like liberal subject who I guess has adopted more radical aesthetics in their own life, but have not, I guess, unlearned or questioned prior or current thought processes to make it seem like and it almost seems like there's like this perfect off ramp into this sort of like J. Sakai style thinking for these people.
Mm.
Yeah, and I, when I point out that until we deal with the primary contradiction, which is the class structure, where there's a ruling minority class of wealthy elites at the top, and the poor working class majority at the bottom, we won't be able to solve these other contradictions. And that's why taking state power, the working class overthrowing this current system and installing the dictatorship of the proletariat, replacing the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, nothing else can be solved. Like we won't be able to mitigate or resolve the other contradictions. But then you get labeled, like you said, like a class reductionist, or you get labeled a chauvinist or a racist by these ultra woke race reductionist people.
They really don't like the word like dictatorship either. Like I tried to reframe it and say things like public power, or like but they still like get really uneasy with this authoritarian or this dictator kind of talk, and and then in the same breath, they're still like, I hate to keep bringing up Joe Biden, I'm so sorry, but then at the same time, they're just like, oh, we've got to uphold this system until we can move on. But like, when is it okay to move on? Like, when are we going to leave this behind and get to where we can actually start the decolonization process, whatever that looks like, and give people their essential needs? Like
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of the main thing that I'm more interested in, is not so much like stamping the decolonized sticker on like certain things and saying we did it, we tore down this statue, and now we have this capitalism that sells like band-aids that are like not just pale and like
Victory.
we like I'm ready to make sure that like healthcare is a human right in this country. Mm-hmm. And obviously if you go to a doctor, and no matter who you are, you're going to get that service. Mm-hmm. If healthcare, or if housing is a human right, everybody gets housing. Like you're going to get housing. If whatever, you could go on, but to simply deny that like a rising tide wouldn't lift all boats in like this instance, because for some reason like America is exceptional in some way, it like really doesn't add up, and it really only leads me to believe that they're not actually interested in helping people.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that, like getting back to this book, the Sakai settlers, given that like it was written in the 80s, it seems really odd that the resurgence in popularity of this book happened during a time where we're seeing a lot of ultra woke, ultra left politics, and being that it's so popular online and in leftist movements today. Do you think that this book feeds into that?
Yeah, I mean, like it seems to, like, pointing out criticisms with it, I guess, seems to upset those people. So I guess I don't really, I would, yeah, I don't know. I don't really have much to emphasize on that, but yeah, I guess it's, it doesn't, and I've heard a lot of people like walk back saying, oh, well, it's not a Marxist text anyway. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like he's like clearly he is identifying as a Maoist. And like, I obviously agree with them when they say that, but I don't think, like, it seems like they are either telling on themselves or Sakai, by saying, actually, yeah, you're right. This is like a completely like liberal analysis. So, but you shouldn't point it out.
Yeah, and then you also in your article you point out the fact that most working class people consider themselves as patriotic, but you know some people might like jump to the fact that you know this is rooted in chauvinism or reactionary patriotism. But can there be like a revolutionary form of American patriotism? And if so, like what do you think that would look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, is this really the hill we're gonna die on when like the the earth necessitates like socialism, and for us to like figure it out like within the next 10 years? And I just don't think that us sort of being mad at people who wear like American flag stuff, or like, I don't, it just seems out of touch with the workers' reality. Because when you think about it, like, I guess like there's the people who are anti-voting, and while that's fair, I understand why someone wouldn't want to vote in this sort of situation. I think for a left-wing person to sort of disregard anybody who does still engage in voting or not want to participate in voting in any way is going against the popularity, or like where is going against the interests of the workers, because it's clearly like the one thing that while not enough people do it, it's clearly the thing that a majority of Americans view as the one form of political engagement. And I'm not saying obviously that necessitates voting for Joe Biden and believing that it's somehow possible that your like pleads on the internet can overpower his like Wall Street like bankroll, but it does say that you should be able to say, oh well, I think Gloria LaRiva should win, or should not win, should run her election, make socialism available on certain ballots, and pique people's interest at the very least, and show that socialism is an option in this country. And if that somehow is legitimizing the settler colonial state, then I don't know what to tell you, because that's in order for you to end U.S. imperialism, like to sort of end worker exploitation in this country, you are going to have to legitimize it, I guess. Like, I think I don't really understand how you can do it otherwise.
You mean like legitimate, like having a sense of like U.S. or American nationalism, like, or
yeah, I get, or just to acknowledge that like people want to identify as Americans, because you can't, like, if you're trying to, like, if you're not trying to make legible this idea of like Americana, or whatever you want to call it, like, what you need some sort of subject to like raise class consciousness with. You can't just say, oh well, those settlers, they're never gonna come around to this kind of thing. I'm too radical for them or whatever. It just turns into like a cult around alienation in that point. It doesn't come around, like socialism is supposed to be something that you can reach, to like your most reactionary uncle, because it tells the truth. You're saying, listen, yeah, like jobs are being sent overseas, like people who are working, people like immigrants from Central America are coming and taking jobs technically, but the solution isn't to put a band-aid on it by closing the borders and like any other sort of reactionary policy. It's to make like end US imperialism and make it so these people can live in their countries peacefully and thrive that way. It's not, and like it's to invest in manufacturing in this country again, and it's to invest in making sure that people one that I kind of talk about with other people is like the issue of abolishing the police, and I mean we kind of have seen how it largely flopped as a movement. One, because of like the failings of like the Chaz, which I think a lot of people have already like forgotten in this like hell year.
Oh, absolutely. Rest in peace,
but I will always make people remember how much of a flop that was.
Oh yeah.
And then but one thing I noticed when I was sort of noticing like organizations sort of different approaches to this summer of like uprisings across the country. And one that stood out to me was the how the Party for Socialism and Liberation sort of framed this issue, because their signs and like their literature that came out of like their, I guess, newspaper frequently said jail killer cops, which is very much not abolitionist in any way, because it's very like you're incarcerating the police. But they go on to kind of talk about how, well, like we're asking for a society that exerts power on like ruling class. The police protect capital, and they also murder a disproportionate amount of Black and brown workers, and like most people would like to see these people in jail. It like really, like we're not asking for the abolition of this the criminal justice system at large, because I mean, in my personal view, that would only yield private security firms the same way that like private prisons have sort of taken the role of like public prisons.
The failure of the original abolitionist movement.
I would, and we're just asking that the charge of murder be respected in the court of law equally to like law enforcement, which I think I've talked to like people who have voted for Trump, they agree. And something else that I would also say is like, perhaps we can, and this I guess falls into like a defunding the police, going like police are, or I guess one thing that I would always discuss with a relative who has like, I guess more of a family friend, they have relatives who are like all cops, and so like they sort of painted me as this like black bloc like commie in like, and they didn't really want to talk to me about it. And I was like, look, I think that police are overworked. Like, I don't think that they should have to answer a call to a mother whose autistic child is like like going through like a panic attack and is like possibly a danger to themselves or their mother, like that should never be a cop's job. Like we should definitely remove the amount of responsibilities, and that like who could disagree? I think like being I don't think any cop would even disagree. They don't want to be in that situation. And this is just what I think thinking like dialectically can like bring you is like, no, we didn't need to take this sort of extremist, like ultra leftist point of view every time, just because it's maximalist and you think that if you shoot for some sort of maximalist point of view, at least you'll get something else, because in this instance it's really gained us nothing but more cultural division.
Mm-hmm. It's been my understanding with the abolitionist movement that, I mean, to me that's what it is. It's replacing it with a system that punishes the state for its crimes. And I think this is what distinguishes me from anarchists, is that to me, it means serving justice accordingly, and taking control over the system of crime and punishment, and paying reparations to those who have suffered from the carceral system, but also punishing cops when they kill people. I completely agree with you. I hear what you're saying. Like some form of it, and that was like a really difficult moment for me a few years ago when I started thinking like that. And so I've been switching up my language and kind of going back and forth between, abolishing the police and reallocating the police's responsibilities. I mean, to me, that sounds like job creation. And if you're like, oh, well, the police are getting 50% of the city's budget, why don't we give that to schools or hospitals instead? And then take control of like private education and take control over private hospitals and say, if you're getting state funded, you're integrating into our system. And if you fuck up, you're gonna be in trouble for it. Like,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a big difference between like bourgeois reform and revolutionary reform, and I think that would be like an example of a revolutionary reform, because then you're creating jobs and you're taking like these these class trader cops out of people's lives of like mental health and other crises.
I think like with this model, speaks to working class people all over, because my conservative, she's 80 years old, and we've talked about this, and she agrees with me. She is very conservative, but she agrees with me. And so it's like people need to learn and understand where Trump voters are coming from and where conservative people are coming from, because it's oftentimes the same place.
Well, and that's something that sorry.
Yeah, no. What I was gonna say was, we probably won't even get this type of revolutionary reform until we change the primary contradiction, because the way that this system is set up right now is to benefit the ruling elite, and they're never going to jail killer cops the way that we want, like in the way that we should, in the way that it should happen. Like, justice will never be in favor of the majority as long as the system is what it is now, and it won't change until we take state power. So that's why it's really important that we start challenging these like abolition, or is like people who just call for like abolishing everything and having no material analysis of the class dynamic, and understanding that what you want to abolish won't happen until we take state power.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that like I've almost realized in terms of how, like, if we're to, like, I feel like I've when I was like an Obama liberal, like I was definitely consciously having to like try and reconcile certain parts of my like ideology. Like I was very much like for peace. I was very anti-war, but like he was starting this this thing in Libya that ended up like restarting the slave trade in
Oh,
Africa. And
oh.
like how what?
Every time I bring that shit up, I like nobody takes me seriously. I mentioned
Well,
like
and
fascist. Go ahead.
I was that person that wouldn't take you seriously because I just thought you were like a lunatic that just was always like against things. But I think that that's largely what this is like a sort of thing that is going through a lot of people's minds in the United States is how can this person who I voted for, who is like the peaceful candidate who wants to bring change, how did he get us involved in five, I think, foreign interventions?
Yep. And and when you compare Obama to Trump, I think that Trump is actually to the left of the Obama administration. I mean, we've escalated certain things under Trump, but we haven't invaded any new countries, and they certainly haven't deported as many people
Mm-hmm.
as Obama. So who is the real fascist here? Like liberals are assigning things they don't understand what they mean. How do we talk to them about that? Like how would you like put yourself back in that mind frame for a second? How how could I talk to you about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I think that it's almost like kind of coming out because you're kind of like you have to kind of tell people you would have to be able to convince me that it's not just like about getting like black pilled and like everything is going to shit because I think that's something that maybe my parents struggle with too is because they I guess can't take the ideological risk of feeling like all this stuff is so rotten to the core and like the system has you feeling so powerless in itself.
Mm-hmm.
So and people are so depressed throughout this whole year at like a much larger rate. So like I don't blame people for wanting to sort of grasp on to their like the good old days of Obama. Like it's sort of this like retrotopia
Right.
that like and
This
you
paleogenesis ultra nationalism, right? That's like
yeah
to me that's sus. Like I'm like, ooh, you want to go back to there? Why?
yeah
Why? When there are people like there's so many organizations and parties in this country and activists and organizations who are trying to build a better future. I mean, we're out here, we exist. There's many things to get involved in, and yeah, there's so much of it. It's overwhelming, and I think that's one thing
mm-hmm.
that has prevented us from making huge wins is that we are such a decentralized movement on the left, and but you know we're still out here, we're still doing things like just because I hate Joe Biden and Donald Trump pretty much the same equally doesn't mean that I don't believe that there's like hope and that there's a lot of really amazing and good things happening. I think I fall into
Mm-hmm.
that black pilled mind frame sometimes when I just I shit on liberals a lot on Facebook. It's what I do, and
Yeah. Well, yeah,
it gets me
when
into a
you're
lot of
quarantined and unemployed, like all you can do is
yeah,
be online.
yeah. I mean, this is what I've always done, and like anybody who adds me, I'm like, hey, this is what I do on the internet. Please don't be surprised in 6 months when something happens and I'm shitting on your favorite Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden. Like, that's what it's gonna be. And my focus is racism on the left. That's like the biggest thing that I talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my next question for you is, what do you think decolonization looks like in the United States? Who's leading that charge in our socialist utopia?
Yeah, and also I just want to add to Fox's question, because we see a lot of like land back or like deport all settlers discourse online. And in your article, which is titled "What Does Decolonization Look Like?" Ask Bolivia, you challenge these ultra woke or ultra leftist takes. So, like, what's a Marxist analysis of decolonization, and how does the recent victory of MAS in Bolivia provide us an example of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I think like most Marxists, like if they did the reading, they would probably agree that we're in an era of imperialism and have been for the past more than 100 years. Probably like a little bit before the turn of the century or what, like where that era, where local or like national capital was growing too big. It needed more places to exploit workers and extract wealth and raw minerals, and like amass their own wealth privately. So they went abroad. They went to South America. They went to Africa. They went to Asia. They went to wherever there wasn't already like a strong capitalist class that kind of had dibs. And so that is sort of that's where I kind of have a hard time with the idea of framing the United States solely in this lens of a settler colonial project. Like, I don't think that you can apply the same solutions to like Israel-Palestine to the United States, because the means of production, I don't even really mean that in like I guess I do mean that in a Marxy way, but like the way things are like reproduced, the way things like who is doing that, and like how land is sort of owned is not in the same like active process of like ethno-based theft, or like ethnic cleansing as it is like ongoing in Palestine at that same scale. Right now, like indigenous people largely compose, I believe, 2% of the entire United States population. And many of these people are either fully assimilated into the United States capitalist system. Many people still live on the reservations, although even so, they are like, while subject to food deserts and a lot of other forms of like scarcity and substandard living conditions, they are assimilated into the imperial core. So I guess that would be really the only difference that I would say between the United States and the rest of Latin America or the Americas at large, because when you think about the history of like and the political orientation of Latin America, for the most part, it was very right wing, in some cases fascist, like outright fascist, and sort of just representative of like this caudillo, like strongman leadership, that was largely just in support of the landowner class, the mine owning class, anybody like just the capitalist class of that region. But in the era of imperialism, that changed because the local capitalists teamed up with these finance capitalists from London or New York to make more money while squeezing the most labor out of the people and the most minerals out of the land. And so that's in Bolivia, that was largely the case for the entire 20th century. There was a blip where they did have a sort of social democracy, but it was pretty violently overthrown and was succeeded by like just neoliberalism, and in one case, a dictator who had violently overthrown the government was elected president in the late 90s, I guess, quote, democratically. But that was changed in the very beginning of the 2000s, where you saw this movement called MAS, which is Movimiento al Socialismo, and it just means movement towards socialism, and they focused on like a certain issue that was plaguing the city of Cochabamba, and it was the target of a water privatization scheme, where the national government was trying to receive an IMF loan, and in typical like IMF fashion, they required forms of austerity, like a measure to enable like the disbursement of the loan. So they required that the water services and I believe the aquifer itself to be put under private control by a US-UK like conglomeration. And they were going to amend the constitution to this, but people were immediately thrown into like a form of struggle, like out of just sheer outrage, because it would have made it the case where people couldn't even collect rainwater from their roofs. They would be subject to like the possibility of being sued by this like conglomeration. So it was out of the blue, or just insane, absurd. So this is where Moss comes in and realizes that in order to unite like sort of salient movement for socialism, you have to stick to these you have to start with these local issues. And they were very, very successful in leading marches and demonstrations against this, and they call it the water wars because of how militant Mas was in the face of like sheer police brutality. And I think after only like half a year, the government had to walk out of the deal with the IMF. And I think the year after that, Mas received, I think, 70% of the local vote in Cochabamba. They replicate that eventually on a national scale, where Evo Morales is elected president in 2005, I believe. And they have this sort of now infamous 2-round voting. And if nobody receives like a certain percentage, they'll have to go to a runoff. But Mas was the first with Evo Morales to receive a portion of the vote that didn't necessitate a second round. He just won outright. And Mas has done that every election year since. But what I would say is the main thing that makes them so popular is the fact that they don't fall to the sort of academic ideals or conceptualizations of what decolonize means and what we're so familiar with here in the United States. And I mean, MAS is a largely indigenous movement. Evo Morales is the first indigenous leader. He's Aymara. They recognized all 36 indigenous languages in the Constitution. They gave rights to the water, indigenous sovereignty. They consider it a plurinational state. But a lot of things that they also did were they built schools. I mean, like similar to what we discussed in Du Bois's description of the Reconstruction. They built schools. They built clinics and hospitals. They built housing. They built what people who are working class need and want. And the thing that sort of kicked off the attempted coup of last year was in fact something that I would probably believe that most sort of decolonize, like hashtag land back people in the United States would shriek at. And Evo Morales was implementing a development of manufacturing in Bolivia, where so he was it was very against like the ideals of degrowth that are similarly like typically associated with decolonization and all that, because he understood that when you refine your product, you escape imperialism because you're giving workers better pay. You're making sure that the nation's economy is not solely dependent on extractive resource, like an extractive resource economy. And yeah, I mean, you're just able to move on past an age of imperialism and set yourself up as like an independent socialist nation. So I guess for all that, to answer this question of like, how do you see decolonization in the United States, I would see it very similarly to how we would envision socialism in this country. Every person a home, every person the right to education, healthcare, the right to a job, access to food, any of these things that existing socialism, either through history and present, have offered to its people. Addressing that contradiction is the best form of disabling a history of colonization and imperialism and racism.
Yeah, and I that just sounds like to me the people that like, you know, engage in this discourse here are, you know, this to me it sounds like it's like bordering on racism, because they're just assuming that this is what all indigenous people want, is to deport all, you know, quote unquote settler or colonizers here and go back to this like, you know, degrowth system, when that's not, and they claim to be socialist, but that's not what socialism is. Like, socialism is a system of plenty, but it's rationally planned to benefit the masses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. No, there was this person who was like, listen, like, this was actually like the only criticism I got, not for this piece, but like, I think it was like in like the comments of a TikTok post. And it was somebody that was like, listen, I have a degree in environmental science, and like, I know what, like basically saying like, I know what indigenous people want. And I was like, are you like, do you just think that indigenous people want like to live in longhouses and teepees and like do, like live like this like life of like, I don't know, it strikes me as like a like concept of like Julius Evola, who wrote about how the Tibetans like really loved the traditional like primitivism of like not having electricity or whatever, and it's like that's the same person that influenced a lot of what Mussolini and like Hitler like ended up kind of thinking. And it's just it all boils down to like this race essentialism.
Yep.
When in fact, if you like investigate like the conditions of indigenous people, I mean, like there are many tribal councils that own like the casinos, or like there's like, if you drive through this country at all, you'll probably happen upon the Love's gas station. They're owned by billionaire Tom Love, who is Chickasaw, I believe. And the Crow, like I know the Crow Nation actually endorsed Trump. But like for one to think that like Tom Love has anything to do with like that person still on the res, like it just, that it doesn't really compute with me, considering that like he's not dealing with this issue of food scarcity and like environmental racism, and like it like his class position is able to lift him out of the struggles of any working person, regardless of his background.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a cancelable offense from Radcliffe. You're in danger, girl. You better watch out.
It's on blast.
I'm gonna screen cap that and share with all my anime picture profile friends.
No, why? What is up with that? Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know, but it's freaking me out. I don't know.
Yeah. Revolutionary anime.
Yeah, the one with Marx that China came out with.
Oh, have you seen it? Do you like it?
I was watching a bit of it. It's good. I mean, it's like boring, obviously, because it's really just like a cartoon biopic.
Oh.
But and like they'll get into, but I mean, it's beautifully done, obviously, and if you like anime and you're a socialist, like you should watch it.
I did want to kind of talk about like deportation and decolonization in the USSR, but I think that's like maybe another topic we can get into a different time, because I feel like that's like a big question. So if you could think about those topics, and maybe we can like reconvene
and we can circle back
and kiki once again, and you know.
Of course, yeah.
So yeah,
Eric, I'd love to.
You know, this was, we really appreciate you coming on to talk about this. Before we wrap up, where can people find your work?
I mean, right now it's really just on that Medium. I think it's erich-arbor.medium.com. I post a lot because I only work 4 days a week right now. So I'm on Twitter, but I believe I'm eventually coming out with something on Twink Revolution, the Twink Rev magazine. So if you want to keep an eye out for that as well, and also give them a read, just in general.
Yes, we love Twink Rev, and that's how we like found you. So thank God.
Yeah, of course.
Thank God for Twink Rev for sure.
And you're in the Midwest, right?
I'm currently in like a flyover state. I'm in Pennsylvania, but it's like a weird arrangement. It's like a COVID arrangement, so I'm not I'm not really familiar with it, but I have witnessed like the entire quarantine and like election season here.
God. Wow.
Yeah, I think Biden will win it, but
Yeah,
it'll be close.
I'm gonna be really surprised if Biden wins, because I don't know. I'm really surprised that Michigan and Wisconsin have come through like this.
I was really, I mean,
Well,
no, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I was kind of like a drunk idiot last night, and I was like, you know what? It's over. Like, Trump wins or whatever. But like, I totally forgot that like, I read somewhere that they did kind of like a poll of like, of mail-in voters, like what their party registration was, and it was like 78% of Democrats, or 78% of mail-in voters were Democrats, like a large margin. And then regarding day of voting, it was like pretty 50-50. So that's why you have, and they count those people first. So that's why you have like these sort of too close to call margins last night. And that's why you're seeing Joe Biden just increase his lead everywhere else now, because now they're actually counting the Democrats. Yeah. And that's also why Trump is like, stop the counting, like, we're done.
Yeah. So me too. Like, I thought it was over too, but then I completely forgot that like these states don't do like the mail-in ballots until the election. Like, I thought that was already accounted for.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't this what they did?
Yeah, and
in the Iowa caucus, where they just kind of like stalled it as long as possible to count things.
Well, and it's funny because that's what they blamed. They were like, oh, this is what Evo Morales is doing, but like it was really just like mirror girl. Like, we've been doing it like all year.
I think it's really interesting that they tried to like point the finger, like before they had even called the election. The OAS in Washington, by the way, Washington D.C. was like, oh, there's voter fraud, and it's like, it's not even over. It's like barely started. How are you assessing this? You pressed the send button on that tweet way too soon. You should have stayed in the drafts.
Keep it in the draft.
I just think this is just going to be, with a Biden win, this is just going to be really 10 times worse for people on the left to like organize and mobilize people under a Biden administration because of all that.
Yeah, and just a final thing, not to go over time, but like I think that it'll force communists and socialists to really speak in clear terms and not mystify anything about what they mean, and run on explicitly socialist platforms, because the American people are kind of screaming for it in a way, because we have these, like, you have a state of like millions of people in like Minnesota, or I guess Michigan perhaps, where the vote is coming down to like 20,000 people. And it's like when you run things on cultural or identitarian issues, like it is going to just naturally come down to the middle on workers, because that's just how they're divided. But if you start to sort of offer this position of like actual class struggle, I think that's where people will find greater legibility in a politic.
Absolutely.
Makes sense to me.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Eric, again for coming on. We look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we will probably be canceled with you, so it'll be fun.
Hey, they can't cancel all of us.